Today's story is a chilling tale shared by a Reddit user whose life took a dark and unexpected turn. What began as suspicion and hidden cameras led him down a twisted path of betrayal, manipulation, and deadly secrets. After discovering his wife's infidelity, he quickly realized that her affair partner was more than he seemed. Soon, he found himself entangled in a criminal network that wouldn't let him walk away unscathed. This story is full of suspense, danger, and shocking twists as he uncovers hidden truths and faces life-altering choices. Stay tuned, because this is one story you won't want to miss. Jack Thompson was a simple man, a mechanic who had spent years building a modest life for himself and his wife, Emma. They lived in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where neighbors exchanged polite waves over the fence and lawns were neatly trimmed. Jack and Emma had been married for 15 years. To everyone around them, they seemed the perfect, content couple. But over time, Jack began to sense something different in Emma. She was always busy, always distracted, her laughter seemed forced, and she avoided his gaze. At first, he brushed it off, convincing himself he was just imagining things. But as weeks passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One day, he noticed Emma's phone buzzing constantly with messages, often late into the night. She claimed it was work, but her secretive behavior only heightened his suspicions. A knot of doubt grew in his stomach. Eventually, Jack couldn't resist any longer. He decided to install a few hidden cameras around the house. Jack felt guilty and nervous as he carefully positioned the cameras. He kept telling himself he'd find nothing, that his paranoia would prove unfounded, and that Emma would still be the woman he loved. But a part of him was bracing for a different answer. Days passed, and Jack waited anxiously, torn between dreading and needing to see the footage. Late one night, when he was certain Emma was asleep, Jack sat in his garage with a laptop and watched the recordings. The first few days were uneventful. Emma's movements were mundane: cooking, reading, making calls. Then, on the fourth day, Jack noticed a change. Emma answered the door, glancing around nervously. A man he didn't recognize stepped inside. He was younger, well-dressed, with a smug air about him that made Jack's skin crawl. The two exchanged looks that spoke volumes, and then the stranger followed Emma upstairs. Jack's heart pounded as he fast-forwarded through the footage. He felt nauseous, a hollow ache spreading through his chest. Betrayed and heartbroken, he closed the laptop, trying to process what he'd seen. He didn't confront her immediately. He needed time to think. He needed to know more about this man. The next day, Jack went through Emma's phone while she was showering. He found messages from a man named Kyle. The messages were affectionate, far too intimate to be professional, and filled with inside jokes he didn't understand. It was clear now. Emma had been lying to him for months. Instead of confronting her, Jack decided to gather more information. He wanted answers, but he also needed evidence. He began tracking her location, piecing together her lies, slowly unmasking the stranger in his wife's life. Days turned into weeks as Jack watched in silence, documenting everything, pretending everything was normal. But his quiet observation revealed something more than just infidelity. The man, Kyle, seemed to be hiding something. Jack noticed strange patterns in the recordings. Kyle would sometimes disappear for hours, even while at Jack's house, making mysterious calls and looking around with a wary eye. One day, while Jack was reviewing footage from Emma's camera, he noticed Kyle pull out a small, unfamiliar bag from his pocket. He handed it to Emma, who seemed nervous. The interaction was brief, and after that, Emma hid the bag in a locked drawer that Jack had never seen before. Jack's suspicion deepened. He realized this was no simple affair. Kyle was mixed up in something darker. Jack took the opportunity to dig into Kyle's background, using every resource he had. After long hours and sleepless nights, he finally found something disturbing. Kyle had a criminal record for fraud, theft, and something vague about drug possession. The man wasn't just a liar, he was dangerous. Jack didn't know how deeply Emma was involved, but he needed to act before she got hurt. He collected all the footage and evidence he had and decided to reach out to the authorities. He explained the situation carefully, emphasizing that his wife was innocent, misled by a criminal posing as her friend. The next day, Jack's plan came to life. Police arrived at their house, catching Emma and Kyle off guard. In the commotion, Kyle was arrested, and Jack felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. As Kyle was escorted to the police car, he shot Jack a venomous look, one that made Jack realize this wasn't over. Emma, devastated, tried to explain herself, but Jack wasn't ready to listen. In her tearful confession, she revealed that she had been manipulated by Kyle, who had slowly lured her into his dangerous world under the guise of romance. She swore that she never meant to betray Jack, but the damage had been done. Weeks later, Jack began receiving strange, anonymous messages. They warned him, cryptic and unsettling, suggesting that Kyle had associates who weren't pleased with his intervention. Jack was now entangled in something bigger than he'd ever imagined. He realized that Kyle's world was reaching into his, threatening the safety of both himself and his family. As Jack pondered the path forward, he knew he'd have to stay vigilant. The betrayal, the arrest, Emma had moved in with her sister while Jack worked through his feelings. He wanted to believe her story that she'd been manipulated by Kyle, but he couldn't shake the images of her sneaking around, lying to him. And, as the anonymous threats continued, Jack realized his own life was now in a shadow of danger, tangled in Kyle's dark world. One evening, Jack came home to find a note slipped under his door. It read, "Asterisk, this isn't over, Jack. Kyle has friends. Asterisk, there was no signature, no clue who'd left it." His stomach twisted, and he spent the night in his garage staring at the note, wondering who could be watching him. He wanted to call the police, but knew he didn't have enough evidence to warrant their protection. Determined to get answers, Jack began investigating the connections he could find. Kyle had been charming and persuasive, but he was also part of a local network of low-level criminals with bigger ambitions. Jack discovered that several of Kyle's old associates had started vanishing under mysterious circumstances, leaving a trail of worried families and unanswered questions. With each new lead, Jack felt himself falling deeper into a dangerous game he wasn't prepared to play. One night, Jack received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was smooth, almost mocking. "You should have left it alone, Jack. Kyle's friends don't like people who interfere. You may have gotten him jailed, but he's not the only one you have to worry about." "Who is this?" Jack demanded, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles went white. The caller laughed. "Just a friend. Consider this a warning. Stay out of things that don't concern you, or you might regret it." Before Jack could respond, the line went dead. He stood there, paralyzed, replaying the conversation in his mind. How far would these people go to keep their secrets safe? The next day, Jack started noticing strange cars parked near his house, always idling for too long, and the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Even his neighbors began to notice. Old Mrs. Henderson from across the street mentioned seeing a man lurking in the shadows one evening, his face hidden by a hood. The more Jack uncovered, the less he felt he could rely on the police. But he did have a friend, a former Marine named David, who owed him a favor. David was the kind of man who didn't ask questions and knew how to handle himself in situations most people couldn't imagine. Jack met him at a diner late one night, spilling the whole story and showing him the note and call records. David listened in silence, then leaned back and folded his arms. "This isn't a game, Jack. You're dealing with people who don't care about lives, but I'll help you for as long as you want to see this through." The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Jack and David set up a basic surveillance system, carefully monitoring the unusual activity around Jack's house. They tried to identify the people who were watching him, hoping to find a pattern or slip-up that might reveal their identities. Finally, one night, they spotted one of the men sneaking around Jack's backyard. He was looking in windows, trying to figure out if Jack was home. David acted quickly, slipping out through the side door and confronting the man in shadows. After a brief scuffle, they managed to overpower him, holding him in Jack's garage for questioning. It didn't take long for him to crack under David's intimidation. He revealed that Kyle had indeed been part of a criminal ring involved in trafficking and money laundering. They'd used Emma's connections and unwitting help to conceal their activities in the town. When Kyle was jailed, it sent shockwaves through the organization, and now they were seeking revenge. "You were just the beginning," the man warned, a sinister smile twisting his lips. "Kyle might be in prison, but he has friends on the outside, and they won't rest until they finish what he started." The chilling words hung in the air as Jack and David exchanged worried glances. They realized the danger was far worse than they'd anticipated. Jack knew he had to warn Emma. Despite everything, she was still tangled up in this, and her life might be at risk too. He reached out to her, explaining the gravity of the situation. Though reluctant at first, Emma agreed to help in any way she could, guilt-ridden for her past mistakes. Together, they decided to dig even deeper, hoping that if they could expose enough of Kyle's network, they might have a chance to dismantle it for good. But as they began to close in on their next lead, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, and that every step closer brought them into an even darker labyrinth. With each new discovery, he felt the walls closing in. Kyle's friends were everywhere, and they'd made it clear they wouldn't let him go quietly. Jack and Emma knew they had one chance to bring down the network that threatened them both, but they'd need to be careful and smart. and they knew they were outmatched, dealing with a criminal network far more dangerous than they'd imagined. Each day, they became more cautious, wary of every car, every stranger, and every shadow. With David's help, they began piecing together the fragments of information they had, hoping to expose Kyle's network once and for all. One evening, Jack and Emma decided to visit an old friend of Kyle's, a man named Marcus who was rumored to have distanced himself from the group after Kyle's arrest. Marcus was known as a quiet but highly intelligent man who had once been the mastermind behind some of Kyle's schemes. If anyone knew the true extent of the network, it would be him. David joined them as they approached Marcus's rundown apartment. They knocked, holding their breath as the sounds of footsteps approached the door. Marcus answered, his face haggard and suspicious. "Who sent you?" he demanded, eyeing them warily. "Marcus, we just need information," Jack said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Kyle's associates have been watching us, and they threaten our lives. We're not safe until we know what we're up against." Marcus hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before gesturing for them to come inside. The apartment was dimly lit, cluttered with papers and half-finished projects. He shut the door behind them, bolting it carefully before speaking in a low voice. "You two have no idea what you're dealing with," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room as if the walls had ears. Kyle was part of something much bigger. He worked with people who didn't just want money, they wanted control, power, and silence. If you've been marked, they won't stop until they get what they want. "What exactly are we up against?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Kyle's group is just a branch of a larger organization that's involved in everything from smuggling to blackmail. They have connections in law enforcement, politics, even local businesses. If they think you're a threat, they'll send someone to take care of it, and you won't see them coming." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "So you're saying there's no way out?" Marcus hesitated. "There's a way, but it's risky. I know a few people on the inside who might be willing to help you if you can gather enough evidence to expose the whole operation. But it won't be easy, and it won't be safe." Jack, Emma, and David exchanged glances, weighing their options. They knew they were out of their depth, but the thought of running away didn't sit well with any of them. Jack took a deep breath, turning to Marcus. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice steady. Marcus outlined a plan that involved gathering evidence from a series of hidden locations where Kyle's group had been storing information. These were places Kyle had mentioned to Marcus in passing, and they held ledgers, documents, and recorded conversations that could implicate several high-ranking members of the network. The plan was dangerous. They'd have to be discreet and work quickly, moving from location to location before anyone caught on. For the next few days, Jack, Emma, and David worked tirelessly, sneaking into abandoned buildings, old warehouses, and even a secluded office building that Kyle's group used as a front. Each location was a new risk, filled with close calls, and every file or recording they uncovered painted an even darker picture of the network's reach. Then, one night, while they were combing through a particularly crucial stash of documents, Emma found something that made her blood run cold. She pulled out a thick file labeled with her name, filled with photos of her, Jack, and even his friends. Detailed notes about their routines, addresses, and schedules were inside. "They've been watching us for months," she whispered, showing him the file. Jack clenched his fists, feeling a mixture of anger and fear. The network had been one step ahead of them the entire time, documenting their every move. It was clear now that this was more than a simple grudge or warning. Kyle's associates were prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened them, including Jack and Emma. But in the same file, they found a list of names and addresses contacts within the organization who were responsible for handling different aspects of Kyle's operations. This information was exactly what they needed to tip the scales in their favor. With it, they had enough evidence to go to the authorities. However, as they prepared to leave the building, Jack heard the faint crunch of footsteps outside the door. Someone had followed them. "Hide, now!" he whispered urgently, pulling Emma and David behind a stack of crates. They waited in tense silence as the door creaked open and two men entered, armed and alert, clearly looking for something or someone. David motioned for them to stay back, slipping out from behind the crates with practiced stealth. He took down one of the men quietly, but the other noticed and raised his weapon. A struggle broke out, and in the chaos, a shot rang out, echoing through the empty building. Jack's heart raced as he heard the man stumble, falling silent. David returned, grim-faced and unhurt, but they all knew this close call was only a taste of what was coming. They needed to get the evidence to someone they could trust, and fast. They made a plan to contact a high-ranking officer named Detective Ramirez, someone David knew to be honest and uncorrupted. They arranged a meeting, slipping the files into a safe deposit box as an extra layer of protection in case anything went wrong. Detective Ramirez listened carefully as Jack and Emma laid out the evidence, his expression growing more serious with each new revelation. He promised to help, though he warned them that taking down such a powerful network would require caution and patience. But just as they began to hope they were finally making progress, a phone call shattered their fragile sense of safety. It was from one of Kyle's associates, calling from a number they couldn't trace. "You may have found some friends in high places, Jack," the voice sneered, "but we have our own connections. Consider this your last warning. Drop the evidence, disappear, or watch everything you love go up in flames." Jack's heart pounded as the call ended, his mind racing. The network was still watching, still circling closer. They would stop at nothing to silence him and everyone involved. Now, Jack and Emma knew there was no turning back. They were in too deep and the clock was ticking. Their only choice was to fight to expose the network, no matter the cost. But with every new step, they felt the dark presence of Kyle's associates tightening around them, a silent threat lurking just out of sight. In a final act of desperation, Jack, Emma, and David prepared for a showdown, knowing that the next few days would decide their fate. They were determined to end this once and for all. Their plan now hinged on getting Detective Ramirez enough evidence to launch a coordinated raid on the organization. As they prepared for the next phase, Jack's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Asterisk, if you think Ramirez can protect you, you're wrong. We have people on the inside too. Asterisk. Jack felt his stomach drop. He showed the message to David, whose face hardened. The text was a stark reminder that even their allies weren't entirely trustworthy. They had no idea how deeply Kyle's network had infiltrated the system. But instead of panicking, they decided to turn it to their advantage. If the network thought they'd lost hope in Ramirez, they might let down their guard. That night, Jack came up with the plan. They would use the files they'd gathered as bait, setting a trap for Kyle's associates. They'd let it slip that they had even more damning evidence stashed in a remote location, one they'd never actually visited, a secluded cabin upstate. They knew it was risky, but it was their best chance to draw Kyle's men out of hiding. David contacted Detective Ramirez and told him about the plan, warning him that this would be their last attempt to bring the network down. Ramirez agreed, arranging a small task force to support them, though he reminded them to stay vigilant. "If they realize it's a setup, you won't have a second chance," he warned. The next evening, Jack, Emma, and David arrived at the cabin, setting up everything to look as though they'd been hiding there for days. They scattered the fake evidence throughout the cabin, including files with false leads and dead-end addresses, carefully crafted to lead Kyle's associates on a wild goose chase. They even left a small burner phone with a single recorded conversation between Jack and Emma discussing the final evidence they supposedly had. Then they waited. The hours crawled by, the silence stretching between them as they kept watch. The tension was suffocating, every rustle of the trees setting their nerves on edge. They knew that the network's people were skilled, ruthless, and wouldn't hesitate to strike. Just after midnight, David heard a car approach, the faint crunch of gravel breaking the stillness. He signaled to Jack and Emma, and they quickly took their positions. Through a gap in the cabin wall, Jack watched as 3 men stepped out of the car. They were armed, their faces obscured, moving with a cold precision that sent chills down Jack's spine. As the men approached the cabin, Jack held his breath, clutching the transmitter that would alert Detective Ramirez's team. The men crept closer, whispering to each other, their movements tense and controlled. Jack pressed the transmitter, signaling Ramirez's team to close in. But as he did, one of the men raised a hand, stopping the others. He looked around, his eyes narrowing, and then he murmured something that made Jack's heart skip a beat. "It's too quiet," the man said, his voice suspicious. "This feels like a setup." Panic surged through Jack. Had they figured it out? He could only hope Ramirez's team would arrive before the men turned back. But just as the men started retreating toward their car, a flash of light swept across the cabin, and Detective Ramirez's team descended upon the scene, surrounding the men before they could escape. What followed was a blur of shouts, scuffles, and gunfire. Jack, Emma, and David stayed low, watching from the cabin as Ramirez's team apprehended the men, disarming them one by one. The raid had worked at least for now, but as Ramirez's team secured the area, Jack noticed one of the men smirking, a cold, calculated look in his eyes. "You think this ends with us?" the man taunted as he was led away. "You just made things worse for yourselves. Kyle's network is bigger than you'll ever understand, and now they know exactly where to find you." The words hung in the air, and Jack felt a sinking feeling. The man's warning echoed in his mind, and he realized they might have only scratched the surface. They'd taken down a handful of Kyle's associates, but the real power, the real danger, was still out there watching, waiting. Back in town, Jack, Emma, and David met with Ramirez, who praised them for their bravery but didn't hide the fact that the battle was far from over. "You've drawn their attention," Ramirez said, his voice grave, "and they won't let this go. But with the evidence you've gathered in tonight's arrests, we finally have a case strong enough to go after the higher-ups. But it's not going to be quick or easy. You'll need to stay vigilant, and you'll need protection." Ramirez arranged for safe housing for Jack and Emma, but Jack knew that even the best protection couldn't fully shield them from Kyle's network. They'd become targets, hunted by powerful people who wouldn't rest until they'd silenced them for good. In the following days, Jack and Emma tried to adjust to their new life, but every sound, every unfamiliar face felt like a potential threat. They couldn't trust anyone, not even the police who were supposed to protect them. David checked in frequently, reminding them to stay strong and to keep an eye out for any signs of trouble. One afternoon, as Jack was reviewing some of the remaining files they hadn't yet turned over to Ramirez, he noticed a name that hadn't come up before: Dante Marconi. The name was circled, highlighted, with a note scribbled beside it: the Silent One. There were no other details, just a single mention of a safe house located far outside the city. Jack felt a surge of determination. He knew that Marconi might hold the key to dismantling the network, but he also knew that finding him wouldn't be easy. The man had earned his nickname because he left no trace, operating in the shadows, pulling the strings without ever stepping into the light. Jack showed the file to Emma and David. They both knew that going after Marconi was their only shot at ending this nightmare, but they also understood the danger it posed. "It's our last chance," Jack said, looking at them with resolve. "If we can bring him down, maybe we can finally be free." With the faintest glimmer of hope, Jack, Emma, and David set their sights on finding Dante Marconi, knowing that the journey ahead would push them to their limits. But they were ready, because now, it was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a fight for justice, for their lives, and for the chance to finally leave the darkness behind. And as they embarked on this final mission, they knew they'd need every ounce of courage they had left.